editor-in-large of Atlantic, as well as the National Journal, Washington editor-in-large, and also editor-in-chief of Atlantic Live, National Journal Live, Quartz Live, and occupies a very unique space in Washington where he's both, I think, a philosophical driver and a strategic thinker, as well as having significant contacts and good relationships across the political spectrum. So we're very fortunate to have Steve with us here today. Steve, it's the topic on everyone's mind. I was talking with a very senior intelligence analyst with decades of experience the other day, and they were saying this situation with ISIS, and we'll call it ISIS as various names, but we'll go with ISIS because that's the commonly used term. This situation with ISIS is as complex and as tangled a proposition as they have ever encountered. I'd like to get your thoughts initially just on where you see that situation, what your perceptions are, and then we can follow on with some questions that we'll try and tease out some more of your understanding of the situation.
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here with you, Richard, and your viewers. I agree with the intelligence analyst. I think that the situation in Syria has become one that's become quite horrible. Throughout various stages of the Syria crisis, people kept saying, looking for the silver bullet, how to solve this. And I said, the fear that I have is, this is a 10-year civil war that has a high chance of running across borders with, 1 million people dead. It's just a really tragic, horrible situation because to fix it requires a leadership by a number of parties that don't talk to each other that we just haven't seen. And into that void and mess, we've seen certain groups evolve, and ISIS is the terror group du jour, in which there has been a lot of consternation in terms of what this had. And so we've been in an awkward situation in the United States where President Obama came out and said Bashar al-Assad has to go, and we didn't enable or take the steps to make that happen. But various groups, including the Free Syrian Army, to give them credit, but also the al-Nusra Front, ISIS or ISIL, and then other groups as well that are sort of smaller factions in the equation have fought for their lives, for justice, for whatnot against Bashar al-Assad. ISIS turns out to be a quite horrible, incredibly violent, a pox on all their houses sort of institution that has been mostly funded through a kind of plunder and spoils campaign, but it has also received significant financial support from, Islamic extremist rich folks in the region, and that has, I think, what's made it interesting is that as ISIS has grown, has basically decided to broaden substantially its appetite for territory and the challenges it's brought on. That's where we're at today. So your intelligence friend is absolutely right on the mark. This is a real mess.
Yes. Your reference to leadership I think is spot on. I think we've got a certainly the situation in Iraq and its relationship with Syria as a result of poor leadership. Obviously, Assad is a unique sort of animal, and al-Maliki's leadership has been very unfortunate in Iraq in terms of bridging sectarian divides. I'm particularly interested in perceptions in Washington about this crisis, and specifically if there's any upside about ISIS. And as you say, it's really a heinous sort of collection of extremists. Is that they worry a lot of people. They worry the Iranians, they worry the Saudis, they worry the Turks. They're of great concern, obviously, to the U.S. and our allies in the region. What's the perception in Washington about the threat, and how we might begin to approach or begin to develop a strategy to address that threat?
Well, ISIS's quick progress and march through so much of the territory in northern and western Iraq has been a wake-up call that the troops and forces we outfitted and trained at considerable expense were a bit of a house of cards. And so there's that sort of reality that's been hard to deal with is that the resilience that we hoped we'd achieve inside Iraq wasn't achieved. That's one realization. A second realization, I think, with regard to ISIS is that the way it is moving, that the threat to Baghdad, the threat to various Shiite holy sites, its reported summary executions of so many Sunni officials and soldiers and others, just people in towns, there have been reports of Turkmen. I mean, a wide variety of people just summarily executed. That runs the risk of triggering a much bigger regional civil conflict that we've all been afraid of, is just basically a Sunni-Shia civil war throughout the region, essentially a competition between, one has to be careful of this, talking about the government, but essentially a Saudi-led, concerned Sunni population with an Iranian-led, Iranian-concerned Shia population. And you end up worrying about what I think John Kerry said today, is that the Middle East, North Africa region becomes a proxy sandbox for a proxy battle between Saudi and Iranian interests. That could be such a horrible nightmare for all of the players involved. And so I think that's the second realization, of staring into the abyss and saying this could be really bad. And now we've got it's basically like the enemy of our enemy became a monster, and nobody can be near it. And I think that the Saudis, since this is an area you work with, have tried to stop informal funding and support from Saudi sources. The government clearly does not support ISIS. I wrote a piece about this the other day, and I tried to distinguish between what Prince Bandar, in my view, was doing and where the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was placing its bets. And it replaced Bandar, who I think had close relations with ISIS, or was trying to work them into a plan that the Saudis had to help support a larger force to attack Damascus and Bashar al-Assad. But in that came undone and unraveled, and Bandar was replaced by, at least for the time being, by the interior minister in Saudi Arabia, and they've gone to great lengths to sort of distance themselves. I think the opportunity, when you talk about possible upside, it's a slim one, but that may be all we get, is if you see for a moment a set of common interests between Bashar al-Assad's Syria, that has bombed ISIS, between Iran, that is arming Maliki and sending material support to Iraq to fight ISIS, and the Saudis, which have gone out of their way to say that they're against ISIS formally, and that what Bandar was doing is not where they're at, then I think if you've got an opportunity to bring all of the warring partners, that have been at war together with together on a greater threat to them, and see where that goes, and perhaps in that you can get a reasonable beginning of a new foundation to begin getting these competitive players in the region to begin talking to one another. What I worry about, and I'll be talking on MSNBC in a bit about this, is that a lot of people are saying, okay, Leslie Gelb, the former head of the Council on Foreign Relations, would say, we need to temporarily ally with the Syrians, the Russians, and the Iranians on this. Maybe so, but don't leave out the Saudis and don't leave out the UAE, because if you do, then you're defining for them what they fear, is that the United States has picked a side in the sectarian divide and is only on that side. You've got to bring in the common interests of the Saudis and others into this too, to keep it from being ripped apart, of creating a greater tension. That's both upside and a terrible downside.
That's an excellent point, and teasing out these complexities is what's so terribly difficult, especially with regard to the Saudis. One of the earmarks of the turning of the tide in Iraq in 2006, 2007 was the awakening and the Sunni tribes turning against AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. What seems to have been the case in this roll-up with ISIL, is either stepping aside or even some cooperative activity on the part of key Sunni tribes, at least as ISIS goes through their holding afterwards. These are relationships that are critical, and relationships that Saudi Arabia has in terms of Sunni tribe. I guess the question is this, and likewise, I think the Saudis are very leery of us going too strongly in with Nouri al-Maliki, because Nouri al-Maliki for the Saudis is seen as unequivocally a Shia tool, an Iranian pro-Shia tool. How do we get at this? I mean, and you know, this is sort of at the ground level, but where are the Saudis in your perception in terms of receptivity to working with the U.S.? I mean, we don't have certainly from the Saudi perspective, we don't have a good track record in Iraq or in Syria. Are we? Is there
I asked the
political will here?
I asked a senior White House official about this exact point the other day, and about a piece that I was publishing that looked at some of what Prince Bandar, when he was head of Saudi intelligence, may have been up to with ISIS. And the official said they weren't going to get into discussing personalities in that, but that they wanted to underscore that the Saudi government had been joined at the hip with the U.S. in terms of now coordinating on Syria, of coordinating in trying to find support and resource strategies for the moderate opposition in Syria, and that they were in regular constructive communication with common concern about the ascending ISIS threat. So I don't think, despite there having been, I think that the end of March meeting between President Obama and King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia was a turning point for a lot of the frustrations that maybe both sides had. And that you may remember that in February of this year, Susan Rice had convened a set of intelligence chiefs from around the region and Midwest, sort of talking about our concern and kind of the shared concerns in the region for the clear ascendance of a, you know, I shouldn't derisively call the warm and fuzzy FSA, which we like to sort of say, you know, here's the crowd, we want them to win, but they just weren't winning. The defining edge of the Syrian rebellion and the resistance fighting somewhat effectively for quite a time against Assad were al-Nusra and ISIS. And it has been frustrating to see their success when you wanted to see folks wanted a more tolerant, diverse, just kind of civil society possibility and aspiration, where you saw people that had a much darker vision, in my view, and the kind of Western liberal view of what ISIS and al-Nusra represented. But there, the big concern is, and there's a debate about the funding of ISIS that I think is a legitimate one and important to have, but at least some of these Middle East players were clearly funding al-Nusra. I make the case that there's been a lot of informal money in the region that has gone to al-Nusra, which also essentially shakes down and extorts and kind of lives off the spoils of sort of a Napoleonic live off what you kill. But that said, I think that when you begin looking at the Saudi-American coordination, it's been rather good. They have been frustrated. They believe we toppled Saddam Hussein and gave Iraq to Iran. I mean, that's fundamentally it. And they also believe that the United States is forfeiting its traditional position as the fundamental arbiter and security guarantor and the kind of keeper of lines in the region. And so there is a growing group of strategists in Saudi Arabia around the king who see that while they don't talk about it explicitly, they need to take steps of building their own security postures, their own forward deployed investments in other nations in their security in a way that doesn't count on the United States in the way that it used to. So you're going to see a more activist Saudi Arabia over time. That doesn't mean they're necessarily funding ISIS formally, because the Saudi government says they're not. But it does mean that you're going to see different behaviors, but it also implies something uncomfortable, is that it implies a strategic contraction of the United States in a way that forces other players to step up. And there is clearly a perception, rightly or wrongly, but there's a perception throughout the region that the United States' ability to sculpt what's going on in the Middle East is just far, far less than it used to be. And in that, you've got a lot of players tugging for the ring, going for the ring to try to control, to try to ascend, to try to become the sort of defining force. And in that, you've got a competition, a sectarian divide, which is also animating the power aspirations of a lot of players in the region. And that is why the U.S. debate is so important, because many people are saying, what can we do? What latitude would we have in that mess? Some are saying that's not the kind of fight we should be deploying soldiers into. Others are saying, like John McCain and others, we can't abdicate our responsibility. We need to get in and return power, that it was a mistake to leave Iraq on any terms, and that this, festering ulcer is becoming just much metastasizing in many other terrible ways throughout the region. So it's a mess, but I do think that the Saudi-U.S. side of it, at least for the time being, is closer than you would have thought.